Brian Mulroney was at the same time the most popular and least popular Prime Minister in Canadian history. This contradiction can be understood that at the height of his power, he had the strongest majority in Canadian history, and by the end of his reign, he had united a nation against him. Brian Mulroney stepped down before he could lose an election. Mulroney had successfully sold an image of a conservative Canada that would give more power to the provinces and a tighter hold on the federal purse. Mulroney had a vision of Canada so grand that it called for a total restructuring of the relationship between the federal government, the provinces, the municipalities, the First Nations, and the people. It was so popular of a concept that the Liberal Party cast aside their image as a party of social justice in favor of one of austerity and fiscal responsibility. The Liberals simply took on the middle of the Mulroney government and accused them of not doing it good enough. By the time 1991 rolled around, Mulroney was polling at 15%, the lowest reported opinion poll rating in Canadian history. When Mulroney stepped down, there wasn't much of a contest for the job. Most of Mulroney's senior ministers simply did not want to be at the helm when the disaster came. It ended up being between Minister of Justice Kim Campbell and a young Minister of Environment, Jean Charest. Campbell won with relative ease.
They lose their voice 3 days of two teams fighting it out, and the one with the best strategy, best cheers, best look wins.
That's it, color war right down here. You were asking a moment ago about why was all this big fight go on about these seats. Well, last night, right underneath us, right next to the Charest block of seats, the official block, the Kim Campbell people took over this area last night, and every time there was a television shot, it looked as though Charest was surrounded by Campbell people. They came in here today, they made sure that they took this area back.
They took every seat, they didn't let any Campbell people sit there, and they also took the other side where Campbell's seats are.
Very important, I'll tell you why. The yellow block up there is Jim Edwards. He has the potential of being the king or queen maker in this convention. That's where his delegates will be. The Charest people very cleverly came in and put a huge section of Charest key people over there next to Edwards. So this goes into a second ballot. The Charest people immediately move in on the Edwards people and say, come with us, come with us, come with us. And that's very important because Edwards is next to Campbell, and therefore the fight goes on for delegates, and they rush in and say, put one of our buttons on, you're coming with us, you're coming with us.
Campbell had no easy task. The Reform Party in the West was cutting into the social conservative vote, and the Bloc Québécois was cutting into the Quebec sovereigntist vote. With the Liberals taking the fiscal votes, the PC party was left with little to no base to draw from. The race, however, was not as far off as some suppose. Campbell had a string of popularity being the first female Prime Minister in Canadian history. Her popularity wasn't enough to raise the party brand, but it was now neck and neck with the Liberal Party. So I understand when Campbell dissolved Parliament, she wasn't being a fool. She thought she had a good chance of securing another 5-year mandate to rebuild the party brand and regain the trust of the people who had fled to other parties. The Liberals had spent years preparing for this moment. They had composed a detailed plan for what they would do in government called the Red Book. This was made long before Jean Chrétien was made party leader. The PC campaign was led by John Tory, whose name may sound familiar. Tory was the leader of the Ontario PC party at the beginning of the new millennium and is the current mayor of Toronto. One of the problems early on was logistics. They simply could not get mailers printed off on a national scale. This meant that local candidates had to be responsible for their own advertising, and when this happened, they began advertising that was off message. The aura of Campbell broke when the PCs ran a controversial campaign advertising that Jean Chrétien's face was ugly, but he suffered from Bell's palsy. People began seeing Campbell as condescending instead of honest.
Is a Prime Minister? Does he understand that his plan to allow a deficit each year would increase our debt? How can he believe that you can kickstart a modern economy by fixing some roads? Why doesn't he answer the questions he's asked? Doesn't he understand the questions? Or the answers? Or both? Jean Chrétien, a Prime Minister? Think twice.
Campbell, of course, lost. The party lost so bad that they could not even form official opposition with just 2 seats, neither of those seats being Campbell's. This also had a major effect on the balance of power in the country. Traditionally, Canada was a 2-party system that alternated between PCs and Liberals, but with the PC party decimated and the rise of powerful third parties, it would forever be the Liberals ruling and juggling the interests of the various parties. The PC party had spent their war chest and were now broke. Not as broke as the NDP, of course, who had to sell their headquarters to stay afloat. With the party having fallen apart, Campbell had not even won her own seat. She stepped down as party leader and Jean Charest stepped up to fill in the shoes. Jean Charest started off his life as a lawyer, but jumped into politics when the opportunity came forward. When he was appointed as Minister of Youth, he became the youngest minister in Canadian history. This accolade was only recently beaten when Trudeau appointed a 23-year-old to a ministry, who messed up that ministry and was demoted. Charest was given the portfolio of fitness and sports, and in 1991 he was made Minister of the Environment. When trying to take party leadership, he impressed most people. He was made Deputy Leader and also made Minister of Industry. Charest could not have known in 1993 that he would be a member of the last PC party cabinet in Canadian history. When Charest took over the party, it was just him and St. John Mayor Elsie Wayne.
I have major concern about programs that only give 20 weeks work, and we seem to get a lot of those here. But permanent employment for 12 months and on down the road is what one is looking for.
Charest had spent his time in opposition mostly fundraising. He was barely present in Parliament, which drew the taunting of Liberals trying to call upon the member for Sherbrooke. The Liberals were looking at the polls and saw the opposition in disarray. Chrétien felt this was a good time to call an election. The 1997 federal election represents the earliest election called by a majority government in Canadian history, serving a year and a half less their term. Chrétien had spent his 3.5 years in government slashing budgets and cutting healthcare funds.
If the Tories are allowed to continue with their cuts, one thing is for sure, you won't get this kind of nice food anymore, nor all the care and attention that goes with it, And then there will be talk of cutting down on the medicines, and before you know it, things like this will just have to go.
It was decided that the less of Chrétien the public saw, the better their chances would be. Chrétien declined media interviews. The PC party had bigger challenges. Due to their poor performance in 1993, they were not an official party. Without official party status, this meant any money they spent on this campaign would not be refunded to them. This meant that if they did not make major inroads, their party could finally collapse. The party is the only Canadian political party in history to distribute a CD-ROM to every Canadian with their platform, and a low-grade video advertisement.
The time is now for all Canadians to let the future begin. Que l'avenir commence. It is my pleasure to introduce you to le chef du Parti Progressiste Conservateur du Canada, the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada, Jean Charest.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
The plan for the PCs was to form a new covenant with Quebec and formally recognize the Quebecois as a nation within Canada. This last promise may sound familiar, because it is one of Stephen Harper's fulfilled years later. Charest was able to pick up a few seats in Atlantic Canada and Quebec, but no big victories. Vote divides with the Reform Party cost him his breakthrough in Ontario, and Western Canada was turning greener every day. Charest was pushed out of the party by members who felt his Quebec strategy doomed the party. Charest moved to provincial politics, where he was made the leader of the Quebec Liberal Party. The PC party was now alone and largely rejected. Their pro-Quebec agenda was rejected in Western Canada, and Quebec, with little to no inroads in Ontario, makes no majority. After he stepped down, a PC leadership contest was held. The party had very little money and could not afford a big convention. They held a teleconference with hubs reporting regional vote counts for party members. They also reduced the admission fee into leadership race that opened it up to anyone. Mulroney's ex-chief of staff and future Senator Hugh Segal ran, as did activist David Orchard, future Manitoba Premier Brian Pallister, and future Senator Michael Fortier. The winner was an oldie but a goodie, Joe Clark. Clark was a former Prime Minister of Canada and was Secretary of State under Mulroney. Like Charest, Clark was very young when he was leader of the PC Party. Upon taking over the PC Party for the second time, he was 57 years old. This can be compared with Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, who was 63. Typically, when a new leader comes to a party, a member vacates their seat for them in exchange for favors later on. This did not happen with the PC Party. Clark would have spent a lot of time fundraising to try and build a war chest to spend on the next election. During this time, Clark stood against the Reform Party in attempts to unite the parties into one. Clark wanted to swallow up the Reform Party, not the other way around. From his position, he had no chance of ever having this happen. Initially, he was able to beat the Reform Party in donations, but once the Canadian Alliance showed up, their donations dwarfed any large donor he could find. It was not until 2000 that Joe Clark would have Scott Bryson step down to give him a seat. Jean Chrétien was a strong strategist and looked at the situation. Joe Clark was continuing to divide the right-wing vote. The Canadian Alliance had just elected a new leader. Clark kept his attention on the Canadian Alliance. He hoped to sway some of the less extreme voters from the party to his brand and make some inroads in Ontario. If he could put up a strong enough showing, the Canadian Alliance would have to give up into his demands.
Joe Clark?
Mr. Day is a past master at reducing complex arguments to a billboard. More and more I think he must be running for office as some kind of game show host, not as the Prime Minister of the country. Can the healthcare system be saved? Yes. Can it be done in respecting the principles of the Canada Health Act? Yes. But there should be no doubt that when Jean Chrétien took billions of dollars out of that healthcare system, he grievously wounded the Canadian healthcare system.
The Liberals, however, had plans for Ontario. The Liberals had spent most of their time in Ontario and picked up most of the seats there. To make matters worse, Joe Clark was so despised in Quebec, the PC Party members in Quebec took out Liberal Party memberships. It is a rather unusual stunt for Liberals. They opted to open their coffers to Ontario and used it to essentially bribe Ontarians with their own money. Joe Clark would lose seats in this election and had an overall worse showing than Charest in 1997. Joe Clark, however, stuck around and became an active participant in Parliament. Jean Chrétien would often refer to Clark as the official leader of the opposition for how strong and effective his opposition was. Joe Clark would step down and threw his support behind Peter MacKay. MacKay would take over the party and shortly after would opt to merge with the Canadian Alliance. At some point, you have to look back at the performance of the PC Party and ask, what went wrong? The PC Party became a party of privilege that saw its goal as simply being to take power, no matter what. While the Bloc had a clear goal of separating from Canada, the Reform had a clear goal of empowering provinces, the NDP wanted to empower a central government, and the Liberals wanted to balance the books, there was nothing to the PC Party. The PC Party became a victim to tradition. They tossed out their strong leader in Charest and replaced him with a lame duck in Joe Clark. Although Clark had been Prime Minister, it was only ever for 6 months. He spent 3 years as leader of the official opposition. Boring into the past, the PC Party stopped being progressive and lived up to their names as Tories.